I've never really considered myself someone who scares easily. I live alone. I watch horror movies before bed. And I've always felt safe in my little apartment until the night I got the first message. It was around 11:30 p.m. I had just turned off the lights and climbed into bed when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. The message read, "I know where you sleep." I sat up, more confused than afraid. I figured it had to be some sort of prank. Wrong number, maybe. I ignored it and went back to sleep. The next night, around the same time, another message. "You look peaceful when you dream." This time, it unsettled me. I hadn't told anyone about my dreams, about how vivid and strange they had been recently. The idea that someone might be watching me, it made my skin crawl. I closed the curtains tighter, double-locked the door, and tried to dismiss it again. But the messages kept coming, every night, always from different numbers, always personal. "Blue pajamas tonight. I like them." "You didn't finish your dinner." "Why do you leave the light on in the hallway?" "Afraid of the dark." They knew everything. What I wore, what I ate, where I sat, how I moved. And yet, my curtains were closed, my blinds too. I told my friends, but most of them thought I was exaggerating. One even suggested I was sending the messages to myself for attention. The police took a report, but without threats or proof of intrusion, there wasn't much they could do. So I started sleeping at my sister's place. I left town for a weekend. I even changed my phone number, but the messages followed me. "Nice guest room. The mattress is loud. Your niece talks in her sleep. Creepy." That was the moment it clicked. This person wasn't just stalking me. They were with me, always one step ahead. Then, suddenly, after weeks of torment, nothing. Silence. No messages. No calls. No signs. Days turned into weeks. I began to breathe normally again. I started going out without checking behind me every 5 seconds. I even left the curtains open one night. And then, 1 month later, the final message arrived. No number, just a notification. "I liked you better when you were scared." I dropped the phone. I couldn't move. That simple sentence destroyed any illusion of safety I had built back. It's been a year. I've moved, changed phones again, updated every lock. I've always loved the quiet that comes with living just outside the city. No traffic sounds, no neighbours yelling through walls, just the rustling of trees and the occasional dog barking in the distance. It felt peaceful, safe. That changed last fall. It started with something small. One night, I was in the living room, watching a documentary with the lights dimmed. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement outside the window. Just a shadow. Quick, barely noticeable. I paused the TV and stood up, walked to the window, and looked out into the yard. Nothing. No one. Just darkness and the faint outline of my garden shed. I figured it was a bird, or maybe a cat. I shrugged it off. But the next night, it happened again. Only this time, the shadow lingered. It didn't move quickly. It stood still, just beyond the reach of the porch light, as if it knew exactly where to stay hidden. I couldn't make out a face or shape, just the silhouette of a figure, still, watching. I flicked the porch light on and opened the door, stepping out a few feet. "Hello?" I called. No answer. The shadow was gone. The following morning, I found footprints in the dirt under the window. Large, deep, not mine. That's when I decided to install cameras. One facing the backyard, another aimed at the porch. I checked the footage the next day. Nothing unusual, no movement, no figures. But the night after that, I saw it again. Same time, same spot. A tall figure standing motionless under the tree near the fence. This time, I didn't go outside. I just locked the door and stayed up all night with a kitchen knife beside me. I reviewed the camera footage the next morning, and there was nothing there. The footage didn't show anything at all. No person, no movement, not even the rustling trees. It was like the thing I saw didn't exist. For the next week, the same thing happened every night. I'd see the figure out the window. Sometimes it moved, walking slowly along the fence line. Sometimes it just stared. But the cameras, still nothing. I started losing sleep. I skipped work. I became obsessed with figuring out what was happening. Was I hallucinating? Was someone messing with me? Then came the night I woke up to the sound of gravel crunching. I stayed perfectly still. My bedroom is at the back of the house, with a clear view of the yard through the blinds. I lifted one slat, and there it was. The figure, standing just a few feet from my window, closer than ever. Still no face, just darkness. And then it waved, not a friendly wave, slow, deliberate. I scrambled backward, nearly falling out of bed. I called the police, heart racing. They arrived within 15 minutes. No one was there. No footprints, no sign of a break-in, nothing. After that night, I left. I packed a bag, stayed with my brother across town. I didn't tell him the full story, just that I didn't feel safe. It's been 6 months. Growing up, I spent almost every summer at my grandparents' cabin by the lake. It was quiet, isolated, and honestly, a little creepy even during the day. The water was always perfectly still, like a sheet of glass. Sometimes, the mist would hang over it in the mornings, making the whole place look frozen in time. Last year, I decided to spend a weekend there alone. It was supposed to be a break from everything. No phones, no noise, just me and the lake. The first day went smoothly. I unpacked, cleaned a little, and even managed to fish off the dock for a few hours. But that night, something weird happened. I couldn't sleep. I kept feeling like someone was watching me through the windows. Every creak of the old cabin sounded too loud. Around 2 a.m, I thought I heard footsteps outside, but when I looked, there was nothing. I told myself it was just animals and forced myself to sleep. The next evening, I sat on the dock around sunset. The water was dead calm. I remember tossing pebbles into it just to watch the ripples break the surface. That's when I noticed something strange. In the reflection, across the lake, there was someone standing near the trees. It was too far to see clearly, just a dark figure. I looked up directly across the water, but I didn't see anyone there. Only when I looked back down at the reflection, they were still there. I thought maybe it was a trick of the light, or that I was just tired. I stared at the spot for a long time, but the figure didn't move. Finally, trying to shake it off, I went back inside. That night was worse. Around midnight, I heard the back door rattle, like someone was trying the handle. It lasted just a second, and then silence. When I got the courage to check, the door was still locked, but the doorknob was wet, even though it hadn't rained. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. I went back to the dock with a coffee, just to enjoy the morning before packing up. But as I sat there, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. In the reflection again, someone standing right at the edge of the dock, maybe 3 feet behind me. Heart hammering, I spun around, and there was no one. I didn't waste any more time. I grabbed my bag, locked up the cabin, and left. On my way out of town, I stopped for gas at the only station nearby. The old man at the register asked if I'd been out at the lake alone. When I said yes, he just shook his head and muttered, "You're lucky." I asked him what he meant, but he didn't answer. He just gave me a look that still makes me uncomfortable when I think about it. I haven't been back since. Even now, I sometimes wonder if it really was just my mind playing tricks on me. But sometimes, when I'm near a calm body of water and catch a glimpse of something that shouldn't be there in the reflection, I remember that weekend, and I don't stick around to find out. When I was 19, a group of friends and I decided to spend a weekend camping at Hollow Lake. It wasn't a well-known place, just a small, quiet lake deep in the woods that a few locals knew about. We heard it was peaceful, and we wanted something away from crowds. The first day was perfect. We set up our tents right near the water, grilled some food, and stayed up late talking by the fire. There was no cell service out there, but none of us cared. It felt good to disconnect. Around midnight, the fire started to die down, and we all began getting ready for bed. That's when we heard it, a splash coming from the lake. At first, we laughed it off, thinking it was just a fish or maybe a beaver. But then we heard another splash, louder this time, like something heavy had fallen into the water. We all turned toward the lake, trying to see through the darkness, but the surface was calm, untouched. It was weird, but none of us wanted to seem scared, so we climbed into our tents and called it a night. Around 3 a.m, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside my tent. Soft, careful steps, moving slowly around us. I held my breath, listening. I could hear the others shifting quietly inside their tents too. They were awake. The footsteps circled our camp for what felt like forever. Then they stopped, right next to my tent. I stared at the thin fabric, half expecting to see a shadow or a hand press against it. But there was nothing, just silence. Eventually, after what felt like hours, I must have drifted off. In the morning, we all talked about it. Every one of us had heard the footsteps, but when we checked around the campsite, there were no footprints, nothing disturbed, not even near the muddy edge of the lake. We tried to laugh it off, but the energy was different that day. We packed up quickly, not saying much. Just before we left, I walked down alone to the lake one last time. The water was so still, it looked like black glass. But as I stood there, I noticed something. Far across the lake, just standing at the tree line, was a person, or at least it looked like one, completely still, watching. I stared for maybe 30 seconds, frozen. I wanted to believe it was just another camper, maybe someone out hiking early. But there was something wrong about how still they were. They didn't move at all. Not even when I turned and shouted to my friends. By the time they got there, whoever or whatever it was gone. We didn't stick around after that. Later, when I told an older guy at a gas station about it, he just shrugged and said, "Things move around that lake sometimes. Best not to bother them." He wouldn't explain more, just said Hollow Lake had always been strange. I don't know what we heard that night. I don't know who or what I saw standing across the water. But I do know that when you're deep in the woods, far from anyone who can help, sometimes you realise you're not as alone as you think. Back in 2012, Sarah, a single mother of two, planned a quiet Easter morning at their home in rural Ohio. Her kids, 6 and 9 years old, were excited. They spent the night before dyeing eggs and arranging baskets full of candy and little toys. It was supposed to be a peaceful holiday. Around 5:30 in the morning, Sarah woke up to a faint noise downstairs. Half asleep, she assumed it was one of her kids sneaking into the living room to peek at the Easter baskets. Smiling to herself, she quietly slipped out of bed, careful not to wake them. As she reached the top of the stairs, she froze. In the faint light from the kitchen, she could see a figure moving, but it wasn't one of her children. It was an adult, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a hooded sweatshirt. Her heart jumped into her throat. For a moment, she couldn't move. The man rifled through drawers, moving smoothly and silently like he had done this before. Sarah backed away slowly, adrenaline kicking in. She ran back to her bedroom, locked the door, and grabbed her phone. Her hands shook as she whispered to the 911 operator what was happening. From behind the door, she could hear the intruder moving through the house. She heard the refrigerator door open and slam shut. Cupboards were being pulled open one after another. Then she heard slow, heavy footsteps coming up the stairs. The old wood creaked under his weight. Sarah held her breath as the doorknob to her room turned slightly. Thank God for the lock. She clutched the phone, barely whispering to the operator, who assured her that officers were minutes away. It felt like hours. Suddenly, the footsteps retreated. The front door slammed open with a loud bang, and the house went silent. When police arrived, they swept the house but confirmed that the intruder had fled. There was no sign of forced entry, meaning Sarah had likely forgotten to lock the front door the night before. But the strangest thing wasn't the break-in. When they checked the living room, they found the kids' Easter baskets had been disturbed. The candy was gone. Instead, each basket had been filled with rusty old tools, a hammer, a box cutter, a thick, dirty rope. No fingerprints were found on the baskets or the tools. Nothing had been stolen from the house. No valuables missing. It was almost like the man had come there for the children and brought his own gifts with him. Sarah moved her family out of that house within a month. The man was never caught, and to this day, every Easter, She double-checks every lock in her new home, sometimes more than once, before she goes to bed. And then 2009, Jason, a college sophomore, went to spend Easter weekend with his grandparents. They lived in a quiet, old town in Pennsylvania, the kind of place where everyone knew each other and little ever changed. Every Easter Sunday, Jason's family attended early morning mass at the local church. It was a towering brick building, built in the late 1800s, with heavy wooden doors and narrow stained glass windows. The kind of place that always seemed colder inside, even in the middle of summer. After the service, Jason's grandfather, who volunteered as a deacon, asked him to stay behind and help lock up. Jason agreed, not thinking much of it. He followed his grandfather through the dark, echoing hallways, flipping off light switches as they went. Finally, they reached the door leading down to the basement, where the Sunday school classrooms and storage rooms were located. Jason had always hated that basement. The staircase was steep, the stone walls sweating moisture, and the air always smelled like mould and old earth. As they descended, Jason felt the hair on his arms stand up. It was freezing down there, much colder than the rest of the church. They moved room by room, making sure everything was secure. That's when Jason heard it. Soft footsteps behind them. Not an echo, not the sound of their own movement. Real, distinct footsteps. He turned around quickly. The hallway was empty. Nothing but shadows clinging to the cracked stone walls. His grandfather seemed unfazed. He simply muttered, "Just ignore it. Keep moving." Jason swallowed hard and nodded. They finished checking the classrooms and entered the main storage room. As his grandfather flipped the last light switch, a loud crash echoed behind them, like a chair being thrown across the room. Jason jumped and spun around. There was no one there, just a metal chair, lying on its side. "Don't acknowledge it," his grandfather repeated firmly. His voice left no room for argument. As they moved back toward the stairs, Jason started hearing something else, whispering, low, urgent voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. He couldn't make out any words, just the constant murmur of sound. At the base of the staircase, Jason made the mistake of looking back. Standing at the end of the hallway was a figure. It was tall and thin, its outline barely visible in the dim, emergency lighting. Its arms were too long, its head tilted unnaturally to one side, almost as if it were studying him. Jason froze. His grandfather grabbed his arm and yanked him toward the stairs. "Don't look at it," he hissed under his breath. They climbed the stairs two at a time. As soon as they slammed the basement door behind them, the church felt warm again. Normal. Neither of them spoke until they were outside, locking the front doors. Later that night, Jason's grandfather finally explained the church had a dark history. In the early 1900s, during an influenza outbreak, dozens of bodies had been buried quickly and improperly beneath the church grounds. The basement classrooms were built on top of old graves. Over the decades, people reported strange occurrences, shadows, whispers, and figures moving just out of sight. The church never officially acknowledged the stories. It was easier to pretend nothing was wrong. Jason never went back inside that church again. Even years later, he could still remember the feeling, the oppressive cold, the whispering voices, and the long-limbed figure standing in the darkness, watching him leave. He didn't need any more proof. Some places just aren't meant to be disturbed.